gotta show me how to get to that.
Yeah, I will.
Thanks for tuning in to today's edition of the Renshaw Report. I'm already reporting from the city. Too tough today. And today our guest is Mike France. He's running against Joe Courtney for the position of congressman in the 2nd District. Mike, thank you for coming on and taking the time to come on. I know you're a busy guy.
Well, it's great to be back with you and your audience, Murray.
So what's happening in the campaign, Mike? We're zeroing down now. The election is in November.
Yep.
October's here already, so you got basically 7 weeks of hard campaigning to do. What are you seeing out on the trail?
Well, the biggest thing that I see is that this election cycle is different than any other one for Eastern Connecticut, because they now have a candidate unlike any other that has run against Joe Courtney. You look at what they perceived about Joe Courtney, now have a reason to look, and the perception of him as a moderate just falls apart. When you are voting right in lockstep with Nancy Pelosi and mostly with 94 to 95% with AOC and the squad, that is just not a moderate voting record. And so now they have a choice and are actually paying attention. That's why this election is very different from the past elections for those of us in Eastern Connecticut.
It appears you lost a little weight since the last time you were on the show. Is that from your campaigning?
It is out in the campaign trail every day, yes.
So let's talk about some of the issues that are on my mind. I think I'm an average person. Let's start with Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pissed off at what's going on over there. You're an ex-military guy. You're in the loop. What are your feelings about Ukraine, and what would you do if elected to Congress to maybe change things?
Well, I think the challenge that we face in Ukraine from the outset is the downfall, frankly, of NATO. NATO is no longer a deterrent force. And the last administration tried to deal with some of that. And the reason that it had become less effective principally was because the economic relations that the European countries entered into with the presumptive enemy of NATO, Russia. When you have economic arrangements related to energy, then you're less available to stand up against that force. And when you have, unfortunately, the president make a statement of, using the phrase, a minor incursion would be okay, then you have real problems. And you look at the history of previous incursions, so the taking of Crimea, and the United States and NATO did nothing. And the argument that Putin made at that time was, well, they speak Russian, they want to be like us. Same thing with Belarus. And so he'd already done this twice, using the excuse of, well, they speak Russian, they want to be like us. And what happened, similarly, he made that same argument with Ukraine. And because Europe was unwilling to stand up, and even in Germany prior to the invasion would not allow military equipment that had their name on it to be sent to Ukraine, there were mixed signals that allowed Putin to think that it was going to be allowed, if you will, by the NATO countries. Miscalculation. I think his generals told him that he was going to be done 2 or 3 days and be in Kyiv and going to be all done. And the reason I suspect that is because there was no logistics train to support the military of Russia. But when you look at how it's been supported since then, I think the real probably the most significant frustration I have is that we're just sending money over there. If we're sending munitions, we're sending equipment, where we have been training with the Ukrainian military for many years, that would be one thing. But when you start sending cash to a country and allowing them to decide how to spend it, I'm not certain that that's the best way to support a military cause.
What is the best way, and what should we be doing that we're not doing? I mean, it's hard on us, but it's a lot harder on them.
Correct.
What would you suggest?
Well, I think there's two facets. You have the people who have left Ukraine who are now seeking refuge in other countries. Poland actually is, I think, still the largest group of people from Ukraine. So providing those countries with the services and support of material for those refugees from the fighting. But inside Ukraine is to give them the resources to be able to fight the battles on their own, which is the equipment. I know there was a discussion at one point about, I believe it was Poland, giving their planes to Ukraine, and then Poland getting additional planes from the U.S. Those kinds of things where we're giving the equipment so that the Ukrainian people can fight the fight that they have to save their country. I think that is the approach to do. I don't know what this money is being used for, and neither does Congress. And we've seen it in the past with sending money to countries and then losing track of where that money goes. So I'm not certain that's the most effective way to support the country of Ukraine and the battle they're fighting against Russia.
So being a non-educated person that I am, I'm more of a reactionary person, and sometimes I speak when I shouldn't. Why wouldn't we send special forces over there to kill them? And come on, we're in 2022 and we're still killing each other. This guy is doing more damage to the world than has been done in my lifetime, and I would think yours. It's out of hand. It's out of control. He's got to be stopped. He's killing those innocent people, slaughtering. It's a huge blunder, and it's affecting the world. It's got to stop. It should stop now. How far out of line am I, Mike?
Well, at a fundamental level, if we sent troops over there and fought and engaged, it would escalate the war. Currently, it is a battle between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine not being a member of NATO, there is no alliance, and if we did step in, that would escalate the battle. And so the best way is to support troops, and frankly, the Ukrainian troops have been being trained by our troops, by our Green Berets, in that base that was in the western end of Ukraine. And so they're a well-trained unit. When you look at Russia as a country, and they're fighting a ground war that when you look back at it, they haven't fought since 1945. All the engagements they've had in Afghanistan and other parts of the world were not a traditional ground war. So their troops are not as effective, and that's why, frankly, Ukraine is doing well. And I think if we continue to support Ukraine in the manner that we have with the equipment they need, I think they will be successful in the end. But if we actually sent troops on the ground, that would escalate the war into a different realm. I think that would bring in other players around the world.
Why wouldn't NATO send troops to
for the same reason?
And make it happen?
For the same reason.
So this guy is a bully, and the world's philosophy is just let him go and let him keep killing those people is the protocol that the world is taking at this.
Well, no, I would say that the NATO countries are all providing equipment to the Ukrainians. There are other people who are going over there from other countries as well as the U.S. who are retired military or ex-military. Many special operators are going on their own to fight and support the Ukrainian cause. But if the country itself goes in and sends troops on the ground under the command of U.S. generals, you've now escalated that war beyond what it is now. And that's a dangerous proposition, much more dangerous than it is the way it's being fought.
How long do you see it going on for?
I don't know. I'm hopeful that it is relatively short. It seems like recently the Ukrainians have had pushback, and you're seeing a loss of morale amongst the Russian troops. And that goes back to the beginning because they were lied to. They were told that they were going in to liberate Russian people from Ukraine. That's what they were told. And when they got there, that's not what happened. And frankly, that's why you saw early on a number of generals being killed on the Russian side, because they were actually up with the fighting force, because that's what had to happen in order to keep the troops moving. But I'm hopeful that it will end shortly. I'm hopeful that Putin will not do what he's threatening escalation, including the use of nuclear weapons.
He has done that as near as yesterday, with his threat to use nuclear weapons.
What's I'm saying? He's escalated the threat. He has not used them yet. And I'm hopeful that he sees the error of ways, or that internal to Russia, they take action to realize that, similar to what happened near the end of World War II with the generals within Germany, trying to end that war there by trying to take out Adolf Hitler. That I think is something that possible that the Russian people will decide that this is not the path they want. But this is not something that military action would do, because it would escalate into a much larger conflict than it is now.
Do you take Putin's threat of using nuclear weapons as a serious threat?
I think we have to take everything he says seriously. Certainly I would hope, and I'm certain that the members of Congress and our military have access to intel that you and I don't have. And so we have some idea on the credibility of that threat. But you have to take every threat that somebody like a dictator like Putin says very seriously and plan accordingly.
So that question opens up other questions for me with regard to the Ukraine, because certainly human rights and human life are at the front and the biggest concern, of the greatest concern. And I think we're all worried about that more than anything. But additionally, economically, we're being ruined. Europe is being ruined. And on the other front is the energy front. Let's talk about energy for a minute, because our energy policy, as far as I'm concerned, sucks. Now, Putin has cut off oil and gas to Europe. I heard the other night, I don't know where it's from, but it's a credible report, I believe, that the United States has enough oil and gas to be self-sufficient, as well as supplying Europe with the same. Is that correct? And what are your thoughts on energy and the lack of an energy policy, or the failure of the energy policy that presently exists in the US of A?
And that is my understanding as well, is that we have over 200 years worth of oil and natural gas resources to supply. We could be energy independent and could be, and were in the last administration, a net exporter of oil around the world. And I think that the one thing that this administration on day one did was to reverse that by doing two things, and among others was, one is to shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have been a resource to bring oil from Canada and to be refined in the United States.
My Democratic friends tell me that that pipeline would do nothing to help the United States.
And they are ignorant, to be blunt. They don't know, because it would not have dealt with oil that is in the United States. It would have, as I said, brought oil down from Canada too. So instead, that oil goes to China. And so that's the difference. Do we want to be giving resources to our economic enemy and potential military enemy in the future, China, or do we want to have that here and being refined in our country with our neighbor, Canada? And that's the reality of the pipeline. The second thing that the Biden administration did was to shut down drilling on federal land. And those two things did largely change the thing. And then the third thing that they did was to tell the oil industry that their days were numbered effectively. And so the oil industry is not investing into additional refinery capacity or drilling, frankly, because the return on that investment can be as much as 6 or 8 years. And in fact, when we had this crisis that happened recently, the administration went to the oil industry and said, we demand, basically, that you open up and start drilling and refining more, but we're going to shut you down in 5 years. And there's no way that if you owned a business, I don't care what business you have, that you have a 6 to 8 year return on investment, that you're going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into additional capacity when you know the power of the federal government can shut you down, and they tell you intentionally that they will shut you down in 5 years. So that's the practical reality this administration has done. But you are correct. And the last administration was actually talking with Europe because they recognized the danger of what we're seeing now with the invasion of Ukraine and the tenuousness of the oil supply from natural gas from Russia to Europe. And in the green energy policy of Europe, they put themselves in this position because they have bought into that the only green energy out there is wind and solar. What is ironic is that within the last 2 months, the EU has declared that both natural gas and nuclear are green energy. Now, nuclear is the cleanest energy available. It produces no carbon at all. And so but the interesting thing is they changed that, and the reason they did is because when Russia cut off the natural gas supply to Germany, and they had shut down all of their nuclear power plants, they went back to coal. And not clean coal like we have here, dirty coal. And so the EU, by comparison, says, well, natural gas is much cleaner than dirty coal, and nuclear power is even cleaner. So it just goes to show that politics or international crises is determining energy policy, not truly science. I will tell you, I think that wind and solar have a place within our energy policy, but to think that you're going to have a source of energy that, obviously for solar, when the sun goes down, you don't have energy, or wind is not there 100% of the time. In fact, it ranges between 25 and 40% capacity, that you're going to put all of your energy demands into those two sources. We need to have a broad supply where wind and solar are part of that, but they're never going to be the sole source of energy in our country or around the world.
Mike, you mentioned that President Biden shut down our energy policies in the first days of office. I'm under the assumption he did that under executive order.
Correct.
And Congress had nothing to do with it. And quite frankly, I didn't hear anybody on either side of the aisle who were elected in Congress make issue with it. I think it's a terrible. I think this executive office powers are overused, and I think it's wrong.
It is. You are correct. And we've seen that over time. It's gotten worse over time. But there were a number of Republicans that complained about it, including, frankly, Senator Manchin from West Virginia as well.
He was bought out, though.
But the reality is the executive order and the Congress failed to do its job and represent the people. And how that would happen is if an executive order is issued, doesn't matter what the subject is, the Congress can pass a law that overrides that executive order. And if they do it in unison, unanimity, then it's veto proof. So the president can't veto it. And that's really what the role of Congress is supposed to do. It's not supposed to have the executive branch writing a law. And that's what effectively happened here. But you're correct. And I will tell you, Joe Courtney said nothing. As we've seen inflation that's largely driven by this energy policy. When you take out and make diesel, in this case, 2.5 times more expensive, almost everything we buy has a tie to diesel. 80% of products come either by a tractor trailer or by train. Both use diesel. And so when you increase the cost of that transport, the fuel by 2 or 2.5 times, that increases the cost of every product we buy. And that's what was the initial driving of inflation through the first half of the year. Then what happened is all the money that the Biden administration dumped into the economy, almost $4 trillion, then there was little that could be done to stop the cost of money, putting all that money without having any economic basis for it in the GDP. And that's the second piece that escalated the inflation to where we are today at about 8.5% year over year.
What's stagflation?
Stagflation is a term that came about during the Carter administration, and essentially it's where inflation gets so high that the economy stops, essentially. It doesn't stop completely, but it does not grow, and so you end up with this, as they talked about in the Carter administration, this malaise, where there's not a lot of energy, prices continue to grow, there's not a lot of business growth, investment. And so that's really the stagflation, where the inflation gets so high that the economy essentially dies in any growth perspective. And so you have to change the basis for it. And what happened now, and for those that don't know, the reason the inflation numbers are where they are, not really higher, is because they took two factors out of the calculation, and that was energy and food. And if you think about it, look back over the last 30 years, we've seen gas prices go up and gas prices go down. but inflation didn't change. The same thing with food prices. You know, the family, when they go and buy food, saw food prices go up and down over the last 30 years at various times, but inflation never changed. That's because those are no longer in the calculation. So when you're talking about 8.5%, you're probably somewhere in the mid-teens or higher overall, because when you look at the cost of fuel, you look at the cost of energy, you look at the cost of fuel, of food, you're somewhere between 25 and 40% increase in inflationary drive.
And how about food shortages? Are you concerned? You have concerns about that?
Absolutely. You know, we've done a number of things that have caused the supply chain to be have problems. We have allowed a lot of our manufacturing, and as well as our food supply, to be brought in from China and other countries, and some of those sources have stopped. And then you look at the cost of fertilizer, your cost of material for farms. Some of that has gone up by a factor of 4 or 5. So it's very expensive to conduct farming, frankly. Fertilizer is substantially higher. And so a lot of that is driving farms to make decisions on what they can do. And then you have processing plants. So you may be able to get farm produce, you may be able to get beef and pork from farms, but then you have factories that don't have the capacity to process that food. And so the supply chain has been damaged.
So if you were elected to Congress, what would you do to change? What could be done to solve one of these problems?
Well, the first thing we have to do, and it's what I've learned in serving first locally. When I served on the town council in Ledyard, what I learned there was how government was supposed to work, where the people could come in and seek redress with their elected officials, and they could talk for 3 minutes and talk about whatever concerns them and expect a direct answer from their elected officials sitting literally 10 feet away from them. In Hartford, it's similar, but I do see some legislators that say, well, if you want to get a hold of me, call my office, send me an email. They've lost touch with the people. So I think that one of the things that first thing needs to be done is in every one of these areas, you need to go talk to the people that work in those areas and listen to them to find out why are these things happening to them. And most of the time you'll find it's something that government did. And they might have had good intentions, might not have, don't know, but listen to the people that are in the industry. So in the case of farming, I would go talk to the farmers. I would talk to the produce farmers. I would go talk to the farmers that have cattle, pigs, and other sources of meat, and go talk to them and say, why are you struggling? What is getting in your way? And listen to what they're telling you and then make changes accordingly. They know better than any politician who has never been a farmer what the problems are. And I would tell you that in most cases, what I've learned in other areas in Hartford, the problems were caused by some regulation or a law that was passed that had consequences that weren't anticipated or weren't considered. And that's what we're seeing now. I think the other challenge that we face when you look at supply chain and where things are being made around outside the United States, we need to create an environment where we are more self-sufficient in our own country for things that are critical to the livelihood of our own people.
So I'm feeling like we've never been more divided now than ever, and I believe. Well, I shouldn't say this in this interview, but Biden's speech the other night, as far as I'm concerned, was more divisive than anything that's happened that I can remember. I believe government on purpose is purposely dividing us to win elections, to control Congress, to control this country. What are your feelings on the division of the United States? I mean, we are so far apart. The left, the right, there's nothing in the middle. I'm a middle of the road guy. I want what's done. I want it to be done right, whether it's the Republican side or the Democrat. Let's do something. Let's do it right. That is not the case from what I see these days.
I would agree with you with that speech. The tone of the color of the lighting, the fact that you had two Marines standing behind it. I've never seen a president give a speech with the military standing behind it. That is not our country. The government and the military are separate entities from each other, and that was the first thing that concerned me. But as far as the divisiveness, I agree with you, that is what we're seeing. What I've learned is that everything about life, and including politics, is about building relationships. As a current ranking member in the Appropriations Committee, and in the past term, the ranking member in the Government Administration Elections Committee, I learned and built relationships with the chairs and worked with them very closely to make sure that the legislation we were passing actually served the people of Connecticut. But if you don't do that and you talk at each other instead of getting to know each other and build those relationships, what you describe is what we have. And unfortunately, I agree with you. I think that our government has done this to the detriment, frankly, to the people. And I think we need to get back to where we are working together and serving the people. And that starts with building relationships, not just in your own party, but across the aisle, and building relationships and policy that serves the people of this country and this state.
So speaking of building relationships, let's talk about a relationship that is falling apart rather than building, and that's the border policy and our immigration policy. Year after year, we hear that the Republican blames the Democrat blames the Republican because we can't solve this immigration problem. Here we are. What did they say? 3 million came in under the Biden administration most recently, and that's what we know about. Our borders policy, our immigration policy, like our energy policy, is a huge failure for the wrong reason. What would you do as a congressman to try to solve that problem?
Well, the key to it is to enforce the law that's on the books. What's happening now is this administration is ignoring the law, and they are ignoring the policy, frankly, for asylum. When you are declaring asylum from your country, you don't get to travel the world and pick a country. When you get out of your country that you're seeking asylum from, the first country you come to is where you seek asylum. But what's happened is the cartels and the people that are human trafficking along the border, are training the people coming across that if you say this word, you are now in a different category, and you are. But that's not reality. When you look at the number of people that qualify for asylum, it's less than 10%. But what happens is when they declare themselves seeking asylum, we don't hold them, because that's not the process. And we set a date in the future for them to come back, and then they don't show up, but we don't know where they are. And that's the practical reality. I grew up in Southern California, and for a period of time I lived in South San Diego, which is literally one town away from the border. San Ysidro, and then you have the Mexican border. And I could see the wall on the hill that is at the border with Mexico. And so I observed people coming across the border and what we had. Decades ago, it was the migrant worker who would come up from Mexico during the growing season, go up to Central California, and then go back to home with the money they earned. Over time, that changed. But what we're seeing today is people will call it an invasion, but effectively it is, because we don't know where these people are going, because they're not coming in under any organized process. And the effect of that is our Border Patrol, instead of protecting our border, are now having to be caretakers of the individuals that are coming across. And when you look at a number of things, the tragedy in this and the loss of life, the young people, the children that are losing their life coming across the Rio Grande, when you look at the parents that are losing their children in this process, and the human trafficking that is going on, it is a tragedy that is plenty avoidable. When you look back, and people talk about this wall, we don't need a wall, we don't need a wall. When you look at how immigration was a century ago, when our grandparents, or particularly great-grandparents, came here between 1880 and 1923, when general immigration happened before it was shut down, that wall was Ellis Island and Castle Garden before that. That was the wall, because you didn't travel by air, like you do today, where you have over 150 different countries being represented coming across the border. They're flying into Mexico and other places, Central America, and coming up. You had to come into a port with a ship, which was controlled. And you had to go through a medical evaluation. And if you didn't meet it, they put you back on the ship and you went home. And that is what happened. to many, many immigrants who are trying to come here to seek a better life. We don't have that today. And when you look at the wall, that is a control device to basically ensure that people coming into our country go through a port of entry. And along the southern border, you have San Diego, you have El Paso, you have a number of ports of entry into our country. That's where you should be entering the country, and not across the open desert through private property. And that's another thing that is not being covered well, is the private property that's being abused by these people coming across with the cartels and coming across the Rio Grande and damaging property and violating property ownership, which is a right. The right of private property and ownership is a right enshrined by the Constitution the government is supposed to protect, and they're not. So that's where we start. But once again, you look at this administration, they're ignoring the problem. They're not going down to the border.
They claim there's no problem.
Correct. They claim the border is secure. We all know it's not, but they can make that claim because they don't go down there and see it. The one thing that you listen to the Border Patrol, similar to what you talked about related to farming and supply chain for food, talking to the people. The last administration went down and talked to the Border Patrol and said, what do we need to do to secure our border? What tools do you need? And the last administration did that. And that's why we had the most secure border we've had. The Stay in Mexico policy, while we evaluated the asylum claims, was solid, because that is what, unless you are a Mexican citizen seeking asylum from the country of Mexico, you don't have a right of entry into the United States to seek asylum. You just don't. That is international law. That's why that policy worked. And those that legitimately had an asylum claim were then brought into this country. But over 90% that would not qualify did not. And that actually constrained and limited the number of people that were coming to this country and seeking asylum, because they knew there was not an open door. But the minute that President Biden was elected and he started telling people and giving indications that he was going to open the border up, so even before he was sworn in and inaugurated, the migrants were starting to come from Central America up through Mexico to come across the border. And literally within days of his inauguration, you started the flood of aliens coming across the border.
Now, another big issue that seems to be happening is the lack of support for public safety. Do you see that? And how can this be happening that we're not giving our public safety personnel the backup and support that they should have and need to have to? And we are a country of law and order, rules and regulations, and we all need to follow them. But right now the criminal seems to have a better chance than the law-abiding citizen.
It's true, and this is where we look at what is the role of government. The principal role of government is to protect individual rights. The greatest among these is life. We go back to the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the greatest of these is life. And when you look at what we've done over the last several years, we saw it in the state of Connecticut with the police accountability bill that took away the qualified immunity from the police in its current form. And effectively, we also have laws on the books in the state of Connecticut that prevent police from doing their job to ensure that if they suspect somebody is doing something wrong, they can then inquire. And simplistically, we've taken and declared that police are villains and are out to get us. And politicians have done that to the point, by law, that the police are concerned about their own livelihood, because they are now putting their own well-being in jeopardy by the courts. And so when they go into an incident you're seeing, in fact, I think it was in Farmington, a police officer just came back on duty. He was, I believe it was crossed between a car, and he hesitated. And the reason he hesitated was because of the environment we've created for our police officers to feel confident doing their job, that because even when they followed their training, even when they followed the policy and the training, they are still blamed for the outcome. And that is not how we are. To your point, law and order. equal protection under the law. That is a hallmark of our country. We are not seeing that today. We have turned criminals into victims. And we have basically said, do whatever you want, and we're not going to prosecute you. The reason our jails or our prisons are empty and we're closing them down is not because crime is down, even though that's what both Governor Malloy and Governor Lamont have stated. It's because we're choosing not to prosecute the crime, and the people who are committing the crimes are not going to jail. We held a press conference last year on juvenile justice, and earlier this year, but the issue there is we've constrained the police and the courts for juveniles that we've now modified it, but at that time, you could only hold a juvenile for 6 hours, and then you had to turn them back over to their parents. And it could take 3 to 4 hours to process the paperwork. The other thing is the police nor the courts had access to their records. So they didn't know if this was the first time that they'd interact with law or the 10th or the 15th. And there were individuals that had been arrested 15, 20, 40 times, and nothing had ever happened to them. And this is what we have created as an environment in our state. And that's why you see police leaving the profession, and how police departments are struggling to get people to apply because of this environment we've created that really puts our communities at risk. And I will tell you, frankly, in the last 6 months, the surprising thing to me is I listen on the radio and I hear in the top and bottom of the hour, you're hearing about shootings in our communities in the area, Norwich and New London and other towns in the area. Unlike I remember, I've been here for 20 years, I don't remember ever hearing things like that. I remember not that long ago, there was a town in Eastern Connecticut that had a murder, and it was the first one in 20 or 30 years in that town. We're seeing a very different community now where people are just not feeling safe on the streets of even our small towns, let alone our urban environments.
Mike, what towns does the 2nd District encompass?
There are 64 towns.
64 towns?
64 towns. And it's basically all of Eastern Connecticut geographically. So from the Massachusetts border to the Sound, from Rhode Island to the Connecticut River, and then a little bit, so on the coastline it goes over to Madison, and north of Hartford it goes up to Suffield and Enfield.
You just came back from Washington. Did you not?
A couple months ago I was down there in Washington.
Yeah, what was that all about? And was that about the campaign?
It was. The part of it was the state party went down to do a fundraising event down there, but I used it to go down and meet with members and talk with them, people I'd built a relationship with previously, and to learn and to understand what was going on down there, and meet with different organizations down there that develop policy and can help me to understand the challenges that are going on from a policy standpoint and kind of where we need to go as a country in order to turn ourselves back on the right track.
You know, I'm a big LeHouillier fan, and I always enjoy your appearances on the show because you articulate the issues so well. But I've got to ask you now, you really think you got a shot at beating Joe Courtney?
I do.
He's a very powerful, popular congressman. Why do you think you have that? I mean, this election, and I mentioned this before, we've got two good men. I like Joe Courtney. I'm always reminded that he's in lockstep with Nancy Pelosi. I'm mad at Nancy Pelosi, but I don't know why. But why do you think that this is a chance for you to win this election? And I give you a lot of credit. It takes a lot of nerve to do what you're doing.
Well, I think at a fundamental level, exactly what you describe is he has become a party line vote. He's been a loyal party line vote for the Democrats, and that is who he is today. And so that's something that nobody really knew before I was running. And when you look at this election, it is unlike any election, any challenger that he's had. For the first time, Eastern Connecticut has somebody challenging Joe Courtney that is unlike me. And so that's the difference. And when you look at Joe Courtney as he votes, I tell people, I said, my parents taught me as I was growing up, actions speak louder than words. It is something that he's been able to do for many, many years, to go around the district and talk about what he's doing. I would encourage everybody to go look at what he's doing when he's voting. But those are the actions. And there are lots of things that get voted on in the House that the Senate doesn't take up, so they never become law. But when you go look at his votes, you see what he has become.
What's the worst one you could tell us about, you think?
I think generally, I don't know if there is a worst one per se, but generally you have a belief that the Constitution doesn't stand on its own and that the Constitution has no power. Because when you look at some of the bills that he has voted for, they're counter to the Constitution. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is the H.R. 1, and for those that don't know, the bill that has the number 1 on it in the House and Senate is the number 1 priority for that term. H.R. 1 was the federalization of elections. The Constitution is very clear that states shall have the right to the manner and form of elections to be determined in that. Now, Joe Courtney claims that he has a legal opinion that says what they were going to do is within the Constitution. I would argue that is not accurate. He may have a legal opinion, but I will tell you, you can get a legal opinion to say just about anything. As they say, prosecutors can get a subpoena or an indictment on a ham sandwich. The challenge with that legal opinion is you have to go back to what was the intention of that section of the Constitution. If you go read the Federalist Papers, which are a book of writings that talk about how the foundings, why this Constitution was written, and you look at that particular section, the Founding Fathers were worried about really two things. There are two themes that come about in those Federalist Papers on this section of the Constitution. One is to make sure that the states held the elections. They didn't want a rogue state saying, yeah, I'm just not going to hold any elections. The second is that they held them at the same time. So you didn't have a running stream of elections throughout the year. That's the two themes that come through on those Federalist Papers. So to take over election law, mandating elections without voter ID, some states do, some states don't. In fact, the majority of states require voter ID, and other things would basically usurp states' authority. And people need to remember, the federal government was created by the states, not the other way around. And so these are things that have changed over time where the federal government has exceeded its authority authorized by the Constitution, and unfortunately we have allowed that to happen. I think the second one is related to the budget, and when we look at that aspect of it. Now the budget, we haven't had a budget in 25 years. So the entire time Joe Courtney's been in office, he's voted for continuing resolutions, which essentially allow you to spend at the same level as you did the previous year, whether you have the revenue to support that spending or not. One of the things that I've learned in my 11 years in office, locally and at the state, serving as the chair of the Finance Committee in my town, and now for 8 years on the Appropriations Committee in Hartford, and now the ranking member, there's a disciplined process in how the budget is supposed to be put together. And there is because of that discipline, that's how policy is supposed to be set. What we see at the federal level, because there is no discipline in this process, is you see bills that have content that has nothing to do with each other, without an estimated cost, but they don't have to say, well, how are you going to support that cost? And that's why you see under the term that Joe Courtney's been in office, our deficit has grown from just over $8 trillion to over $31 trillion in his time in office, because he's not done things to make sure that we are fiscally responsible as a federal government. And that has led to where we are in this very rapid inflation that we're seeing and challenging in the economy. That set the foundation for it. So I think that's the thing where you have to get back to first principles of our constitutional form of government and constraining the power of government to enact laws. And that is what I see in Joe Courtney, is somebody who just doesn't believe the Constitution matters.
Was it John Adams that warned of the two-party system?
They did. They did.
I'm beginning to think that there's something to that.
There is, and the challenge really has become over time, I think that you have when we talked about the division within the country, you have the people that are making the most noise in both parties are the extremes of those parties. And that is something that is not helpful to our country. I think that we need to have more people that are going to have dialogue across party lines, because we all represent the people of this country. We all represent, and as I am in the legislature, we represent the people of our district, but more importantly, the people of our state. Because the policy we enact while we're elected by a district in the state impacts the entire state, and we need to understand that. And so if you come from, like I do, Ledyard, a more rural or suburban part of the state, talking to the legislators that come from the cities or come from the more rural parts to understand the impact of the law you're about to pass. If you don't have those conversations, you don't know whether it's the right policy. And that, I think, is something that's been lost, frankly, at the federal level, and we don't have those dialogues. And so we don't understand, and we don't take the time, principle of first seek to understand. As we say, we learn as we're growing up. Some parents, and mine did, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You should listen twice as much as you talk. and there's truth in that, because we should listen to what others say. And unfortunately, what I see too many times is people talking at each other. They're thinking about what they're going to say next, and they're not listening to what people are telling them. I think we need to get back to the art of listening and understanding and seeking to understand others before we assume we know what others are believing.
Now, with such a short period of time until the election, which is, as we said, was it 7 weeks? That what it is? Something like that?
Just under 7 weeks.
You must have a campaign strategy that you guys are following. Obviously, you can't knock on everybody's door in that amount of time. How are you going to get your message out to the people? Number one. Number two, are there any debates between you and Joe scheduled? And where do you stand on debating him?
What we're doing is we're going across the district in groups, small, large. Wherever there's a meeting of people, I will be there. I do it on the radio, shows like this. I've been on several TV shows, the news shows that have been on. So that's how you're getting your word out. But then it's also word of mouth. It is people that are your supporters talking to
what do you
their friends.
see? What are the people that you're in contact? What are their concerns? Well,
the biggest concerns they have are twofold. One is public safety, as we've talked about, with the issue with police and qualified immunity and not having them out there to protect our citizens.
And do they know why we've
do.
ended up like this?
They do. And the second thing is inflation. It's the cost of putting food on the table and parents having to make choices about how they live their lives from a financial aspect like they've never seen in 40 years. That is a practical reality that every family is dealing with. So those are the two predominant ones, and both of those things were caused by government. That is the one thing that is common to almost every problem that we deal with today. Almost every one is the cause by policy created either at the state or federal level or both.
Wasn't there a guy that said, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you"?
Well, that is what Ronald Reagan said were the 11 most scary words in the English language and put together. And that is true. And that we have seen, what I have seen is that too many times government's not solving problems, they're treating symptoms of problems and not really caring. I shouldn't say not really caring, that's not fair, not really looking at what the potential outcome of this policy enactment. And even when confronted with what is the likely outcome, they take a position of putting it in place anyway and then seeing what happens. And that's not what government should do, because that's damaging to the people that they're supposed to serve. And we see that on a routine basis, unfortunately. You mentioned debates. Currently there's a debate scheduled October 12th, sponsored by the Day. It'll be at the Guard Art. There's one that recently reached out, League of Women Voters, on October 4th. We're still waiting on the details for that one. So far there's 2 debates that are scheduled.
Do you bump into Joe at all, or you guys on
Yep,
speaking terms?
We did. Yeah, the last time I was in the same place with him was at Old Home Days in East Hampton. We were marching in the parade, and we happened to run into each other, and we had a pleasant conversation, 15, 20 minutes. And I've been with him over the time in legislature, and pleasant conversations. So nothing, to your point, he is a nice guy, and nothing against him.
Anything we can do to start some trouble here today?
No, I don't have anything against him personally. I have an issue with the policies because policies.
That's what's great about this election between you two, because you're both gentlemen, and I haven't seen the dirty politics come out on either side, and I think that's good for democracy, and I think it's good for our state.
I try to do that because it doesn't do any good to have personal attacks, because the personal attacks don't have merit, frankly, with what the people care about. People care about how they're going to live their lives, how they're going to put gas in their cars, how they're going to afford to heat their houses this winter when heating oil costs are 2 or 3 times.
How are they going to, Mike?
Good question. We recently had a special meeting of to look at LICEF program, which is a federally funded program, the Low Income Heating Assistance Program, and the proposal from the administration to the appropriations, the energy, and the human services committees was substantially below what it was last year. There were about $50 million of federal ARPA money that was included in last year, along with about $73 million from the program. This year, they didn't include any ARPA money, and 2 things have happened. One, I just talked about, is the cost of heating oil has gone up substantially. But the second is there's greater demand. There's about between 5 and 10% more people that qualify for this program and have applied. So greater demand, higher cost means you need more resources to be able to provide the services. Instead, the proposal was to cut the amount of money that was being provided to those in need. We proposed an amendment that would have included almost $120 million of money from the federal government under ARPA that's just sitting in an account. It's called Invest CT, but it's just sitting there, over $165 million, doing nothing. And so we said we should give back to the people their money from the federal government, same as we did last year, maintain the same level of support that was provided last year, and even expand it so that the people don't have to worry about how they're going to heat their homes.
And why would the Democrats not go along with that?
I don't know. It is disappointing because they ruled the amendment out of order, which means it was against the rules, simplistically.
Who specifically did that?
Each of the committees' leaderships, all 3 of them, we proposed it in all 3 committees, and each of them ruled it out of order. The interesting thing is back in 2008, when we faced a similar crisis, a similar financial crisis, and similar heating oil crisis, there was an amendment that didn't use federal money, but used state money. And it was pending action by the legislature, but it was approved. We did a similar thing in 2017. So there's precedents where we did this. I don't know why the Democrats ruled it out of order and didn't want to have this debate, but their excuse, and it's purely an excuse, well, we're coming into session in January, we can deal with it then. The money has a possibility of running out in November. We have the potential that those greatest of need are not going to have the resources to heat their homes this winter. We're going to have serious problems. I'm very concerned about that. I'm disappointed that we didn't come together to serve those most in need.
Like, we only got 2 minutes left. One state question. Lamont made a headlines today with a huge budget surplus. Are those figures accurate? I think it's full of baloney. But as one of our top legislators, do you concur that we have this huge budget surplus?
We do. And the reason we have it is because of the Republican budget that became the bipartisan budget in 2017. So in 2017, our budget passed out of the House, was vetoed by Governor Malloy, but it became the basis for the bipartisan budget that was eventually passed, and it constrained the spending. We had a spending cap, a bonding cap, but the most significant was the volatility cap, which capped the amount of money of the volatile revenue, largely seen as most common one would be capital gains, so investment money, which varies year in, year out. And
well,
so
I hope you didn't invest in the stock market. We're out of time, Mike, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you,
It was a great
Murray.
interview, and Mike certainly deserves our consideration this upcoming election. Murray, reporting to the City Too Tough to Die in London.